What is going on, everybody? My name is Michael Levan, and welcome to part 3 of the Development for Infrastructure series. In this part, we're going to go over source control, what it is, why you would use it, the difference between a few different source control systems, and then, of course, we're going to jump in and we're going to do a demo. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So let's go ahead and jump into a little bit about source control. So the first thing is, why source control? Well, let me give you a very, very common scenario when people aren't using source control. Let's say you have a OneDrive account and you have a bunch of scripts in there that, maybe are for testing workloads or for production level workloads, and you're doing some automation. So you have this OneDrive folder, you have the code in there, you save it, everything works. And then maybe, a week or two later, you go to use it again and the code's actually broken. Well, here's the problem. You have no idea why. Maybe you have an idea of what was changed, but you got to really dig in there, especially if it's 200-300 lines of code. You have no idea what's happening. So with that, you need a place that you can store it. You need a place that has history of the code. So what was changed? So let's say something is broken, you can revert it back. Another thing too is that if you want multiple people to be able to collaborate with you on this code, you need a place that they can actually go to collaborate. And then you also want a place where you can actually centralize where the code is. You don't want it to be in this person's OneDrive and that person's OneDrive and that person's desktop and that person's documents folder. It just becomes too cumbersome. Now, there is a little bit of theory based on distributed versus centralized version control. Now, centralized version control, it's a client-server relationship, meaning you're the client, and then the server is wherever it is, in an on-prem data center, in the cloud, something like that. So you're able to interact with the service where the code is, and it's over the internet. Now, the thing here is that the repository is located at one place, and it provides access to multiple clients. So you, all of your teammates, everything. Now, here's the problem with centralized version control. There's one server, there's one repository. So you're constantly hitting this server where everybody else is. So now let's say you make a change and then somebody else makes a change to the same code. There's going to be a conflict there. It's one location, that's it. Now, when you think about distributed version control, every user has a copy of that repository on their machines. So for example, let's say you're editing some PowerShell code and a bunch of other people are doing the same thing in that repository. All of that code is sitting locally. So then at that point, you can make changes and then you could push those changes up. And then if there are any merge conflicts or anything, well, you can simply pull down the code, see what has changed, make the updates, and then push it back up. Now, the biggest thing here is that every user has a local copy on their machines. Now, I do want to say this. The reason why a lot of people maybe still use centralized version control is because you got to think about it for a second. Let's say you're, I don't know, Microsoft, and you're creating an operating system. Well, that operating system is, I don't know, 50 gigs, 60 gigs. So imagine having to constantly download and upload all of that information down to your machine. It's going to be a lot, especially if you don't have great internet. I mean, that's a lot of data. So what you want to really be able to do is, if you have a large ecosystem of code like that, maybe you want to use centralized. But if you have a standard, ecosystem of code where it's maybe a couple megs or even a couple gigs or something, then maybe you want to use distributed. I have VS Code open here. Specifically, I have a development for infrastructure repository, and we're going to take a look at that repository in just a second. But I have this repository open for this series. So if I go to part 1, you're going to see all of the code that I used for the first video talking about developer theory. So what I want to do here is I want to do part 3. Now, part 2, we don't have a part 2 because it was really just about the text editor itself, so we weren't actually committing any code. So from here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create just a real simple main.go file. I'm going to say package main. Again, don't worry about the code here. This is really just more to show something that I'm pushing up to GitHub. Go here and I'm just going to do fmt for the import. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to define a main function. And in this main function, I'm just going to say println hello YouTube. And then all this is going to do is it's going to simply print out some code to the console, and the code is just going to say hello YouTube. So right off the bat, we can see here that from my GitHub extension or my source control extension, I have this one here. And what I can do is I can commit this code and I can push it up to GitHub. But instead, maybe you might not use that extension or maybe you don't like it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the terminal here. I'm going to clear my screen. And the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to run git add. What git add is going to do is it's going to stage your environment. It's going to let GitHub know, okay, I'm actually ready to be pushing up some code here. So then I'm going to run git commit and I'm going to do -m. -m means you're going to give it a message, a commit message. So I'm going to say test code for part 3. And now my code is committed. On my local repository, my code is committed. So now I want to take that code from my local repository and I want to push it up to my GitHub repository, that centralized repository. And to do that, I'm going to run git push, and then I'm going to specify origin. Now origin is where the code is and where the code is going. Say origin, and then here's where you can specify your branch. So I'm going to say master. And then as you can see, it specifically says that the ref spec master does not match anything for the development for infrastructure repo. And the reason why is because if I run git branch, we can see here that the branch is actually called main. So if you try to push some code to a branch that doesn't exist, it's going to let you know, hey, this branch doesn't exist. I can't do anything for you. So I'm going to go back up here. I'm going to type in main. Right, and then this code is going to successfully push to the main branch in GitHub. So now let's head over to the GitHub UI and we're going to take a look at that code in action, and then I'm also going to show you how to create a repository. I'm at my GitHub here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to repositories, and then under repositories you're going to see that it was updated 1 minute ago. So I'm going to click on the development for infrastructure repository, and then as you can see, if I go to part 3 here, I click on main.go, I see my code here. So this is kind of how to get started if you already have a Git repository. But what if you don't have a Git repository, or better yet, what if you don't have a GitHub account? Well, if you don't have a GitHub account, simply just go to github.com, and then what you can do is you can sign up for free. There's a big sign up button and you could log in via Gmail or anything that you want. I'm going to close out of here, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to create a quick repository. So I'm going to go back to my admin turned DevOps GitHub organization, and I'm going to scroll and click on repositories, and then from repositories I'm going to click new, and then now I can create a new repository. So test repo, I can give this a description, test repo for YouTube, and then I can specify public or private. So public means anybody on GitHub, they actually don't even need a GitHub account. Anybody in the world can see this code. If you click private, that means only the people that you give access to explicitly can see the code. Then I can scroll down here and I can specify a README. And a README is, kind of think about it like some quick documentation or just a quick step-by-step guide on what your code is going to look like. A git ignore right here, that means that there's certain extensions that you can ignore. So for example, in your repository, let's say you want to ignore any file that has a .go extension, you can do that. And then you can also choose a license. And the license essentially tells people what the code is doing. So for example, if it's an MIT license, the MIT license essentially says, yep, this is open source, you can do whatever you want with it. However, if it breaks something on your computer, we're not responsible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click create repository. And then now we officially have a repository. And if you look here, you can see there's instructions right off the bat on how you can initialize this new repository from the command line. But before you actually do that, you need to be able to clone that repository. And to clone the repository, I'm going to go to test repo here. And right here, you can see setup in a desktop, or you have an HTTPS or SSH. So if I, for example, click this copy button for HTTPS and I open up my terminal, I can actually do a git clone and clone this repository down. And that concludes part 3 of the Development for Infrastructure series. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you for part 4.